Okay, let's jump in. Think about that image of Icarus, right? Flying high with these amazing wings his father Daedalus made. It's all about human achievement, like beating our limits.
Yeah, ingenuity personified.
But then, well, it goes wrong. The power's too much, he gets careless, flies too close to the sun, and crash.
It's such a potent myth, a real warning almost.
And it feels so relevant for what we're digging into today.
It really does. It nails that tension, doesn't it? Science
Yeah.
gives us this incredible power, but are we actually, ready for it? Do we have the wisdom, the heart maybe?
Does the scientific head get way ahead of the ethical heart?
Exactly.
And that tension, that's right at the center of this really fascinating piece we're exploring today. We're doing a deep dive into an essay from, get this, exactly 100 years ago, 1924,
Wow, eccentric.
by the philosopher Bertrand Russell, often quite provocative, sometimes seen as pessimistic.
Mm-hmm.
And the essay title, maybe not surprising given the myth, Icarus, or
Hmm.
The Future of Science.
Right, and he was actually writing it partly in response to someone else, J.B.S. Haldane, who wrote Daedalus, or Science in the Future. Haldane was pretty optimistic, seeing science leading us to, well, a happier future.
And Russell,
Russell looked around, saw the world, especially post-World War I, and basically said, hold on a minute. He offered a much darker take, more skeptical. He argued science, if it's just guided by human nature as it is, could just as easily lead to, destruction.
okay. So our mission today is to really get into Russell's arguments from this essay. What were his big fears about science 100 years back? How did he see it connecting with power, with how society's organized, with our basic human drives?
And maybe what echoes do we still hear today? What feels relevant?
Exactly. What uncomfortable stuff might he still be pointing out for us?
We'll look at his take on the physical sciences, how they were already changing industry, driving conflict. Then there's his ideas on how organization was, intensifying everywhere because of technology. And then we get to the really, maybe unsettling part. His speculations about biology and what he called anthropological sciences. Things like eugenics, psychological control. Pretty chilling stuff, potentially.
It definitely sounds like a journey into someone grappling with the dark side of progress.
Yeah?
So let's start where Russell kicks off. Right at the beginning, he makes this really key distinction about how science affects us. He says it does one of two things.
Okay.
Either it just gives us more power to get what we already want without changing those wants, or our view of the world, or number two, it actually changes how we imagine the world, our whole conception of it.
And which one did he think was dominant?
Well, he immediately says that the first one, just giving us more power to chase our existing desires, that one has been way more important historically.
And that's where his pessimism really starts.
Yeah.
Because, science gave us all this amazing control over nature. Logically, if we were purely rational, purely self-interested, that should mean more happiness, right?
Seems logical.
But Russell's big idea is that humans aren't purely rational. We're, in his words, bundles of passions and instincts.
Like wolves, he says, driven by instinct.
Exactly. He uses that analogy. Wolves hunt instinctively, give their descendants, domestic dogs, unlimited food. What happens? They just gorge themselves.
Right.
Science, he argues, has upset the balance for humans in a similar way. But for us, the big danger isn't overeating. It's overfighting. Our instincts for power, for rivalry they need, like deliberate checks in this new scientific industrial age.
That's quite an image. Science gives us these superpowered tools, but the people using them still have the same old, maybe dangerous programming.
Pretty much. And he breaks down the sciences into three groups to talk about their impact. Physical sciences, physics, chemistry, biological sciences dealing with life, and then anthropological sciences, the study of humans themselves.
Yeah.
Physiology, psychology, economics, history.
Okay, 3 buckets.
So back then, in 1924, Russell thought the biological sciences hadn't actually changed practical life all that much. Their main effect was more on our imaginative outlook.
Like Darwinism changing how people thought about competition.
Yeah, exactly. He does mention future possibilities, things like Mendelism, heredity maybe applied to agriculture or even people, bacteriology, potential for germ warfare, eugenics becoming more targeted, maybe even determining sex.
Scary potential.
But it kind of sets those aside for a bit, says Haldane already covered them, and saves their really big, maybe illimitable impact for later in the essay.
Okay. And the anthropological sciences, the ones studying humans directly, you'd think they'd have had a massive effect.
You would think.
Yeah.
But Russell argues their impact was also pretty limited back then, partly because they were still quite new. Economics, he felt, didn't change much unless it happened to line up with what powerful people already wanted. Medicine, yeah, that made a difference. Sanitation, public health. And he flags birth control as a big social change. But again, the really deep, game-changing future stuff, he puts a pin in that for later.
So the main driver of change up to 1924, in his view, was clearly the physical sciences.
Absolutely. Driving the Industrial Revolution. We all know that story. But Russell draws some specific, quite potent conclusions from it.
Like what?
Well, first, he stresses that industrialism was still spreading. It wasn't just a Western thing anymore. Russia, India, China, South America, they were all getting industrialized. He saw this making the world like one economic unit eventually.
Okay, globalization in its early stages.
And the consequences would depend on it becoming truly universal. The effects weren't fixed, they'd change as it spread.
Makes sense. What else?
Second big point. Industrialism massively boosted productivity. Now, in England, initially, this just meant a larger population, but actually a lower standard of living for many.
Right, the early horrors?
Then came what he calls a sort of golden age rising wages, a thriving middle class. But then, as other countries industrialized, things changed again. Organization didn't become global, it became fiercely national.
So competition shifted.
Totally. From individual companies competing to nations competing intensely.
And that's where that over-fighting instinct he mentioned comes back in.
Bingo. All that extra productivity, the labor freed up by machines. It doesn't just go into more leisure time, it gets funneled into national rivalry.
How so?
Russell points to bigger armies, more weapons factories, diplomats maneuvering, teachers pushing patriotism, the press whipping up national feeling. Even scientists, he notes, kind of cynically, are busy inventing better ways to kill each other. And the terrible result. Fewer people might be on the front line itself, but war becomes aimed more and more at destroying whole civilian populations. Industry makes total war possible.
And he links this directly to resources, right?
Absolutely. Physical science and industry make things like coal, iron, oil the absolute basis of national power. He criticizes economists for maybe underplaying how much military force has always been used to grab wealth. And in his time, fighting a modern war depended completely on controlling those scientific and industrial resources.
So if we sum up the effects of physical sciences as he saw them by 1924.
He saw increased productivity being used for three things, basically in sequence. First, just grow the population. Second, raise living standards, but maybe only a bit.
Right.
And third, and this is the worrying part, pour more and more energy into war, driven by this intense national competition for markets, for resources.
Which leads right into his next huge point, the massive increase in organization.
Yes. He sees this as totally central to industrialism. You can't have large-scale production without large organizations. Factories, companies, eventually states coordinating things.
And science didn't just create the need for these big structures.
It also provided the tools to run them, the technology to actually control these massive entities effectively.
How so? What tools?
Think about it. Before railways, telegraphs, telephones, how could a central government really control a huge area? It was hard. Ancient empires had governors who were pretty independent, ambassadors had lots of leeway, businesses were looser, local differences were just the norm.
Right, communication and travel were slow.
But science changed everything. Telegraph, telephone, wireless, suddenly you could send orders instantly from the center. Railways, steamships, you could move troops or officials quickly to make sure people obeyed.
Okay, the speed of control increased dramatically.
And think about information. Modern printing presses, advertising, they favored big national newspapers, which led to, well, a scary uniformity of opinion, Russell thought. Even state education aimed for uniformity, turning teachers into, like, standardized parts in a machine.
Wow. Standardized opinions, standardized people.
And as the technical ability to organize grew, he noticed the psychology changed too. With more productivity, you could dedicate more effort purely to propaganda.
Through.
Advertising, movies, the press, schools, politics, even radio, which was just starting. Once people got used to it, it could be another tool for mass messaging.
So technology enables tighter control, and propaganda shapes the mindset to accept it.
Exactly. And this intensification of organization, Russell says, means what you do as an individual becomes less spontaneous, less based on your own decisions.
And more dictated by the groups you're in.
Precisely. He talks about the intensity of organization. How much of your life is directed by group orders or advice? Compare a farmer or a craftsman back then to someone in a modern factory or government office. The industrial age just cranks that intensity way, way up.
But he wasn't just saying organization bad, was he?
No, no. He's careful about that. He says we need to think about how much organization, where, when, what kind. Not just these simple political arguments of his time like total anarchy versus total state control. He admits he's temperamentally an anarchist himself.
Huh, Russell.
Yeah. But he acknowledges the modern world needs more organization just to function, to avoid chaos. The problem isn't organization itself, it's the nature of it and what its goals are.
And the type matters too, he said.
Hugely. He saw that even where you had formal democracy expanding, real democratic control might actually be shrinking. Because the people in charge of the executives could control the information, control the messaging through propaganda. Company bosses weren't really controlled by shareholders. Party leaders got powerful using sophisticated PR. Groups became more disciplined, more obedient to leaders. He thought power was concentrating in the hands of a few big personalities more and more.
Okay, so organization increases, but maybe genuine control by the people decreases.
That's his fear. And here's the tragedy, as he sees it. All this powerful, science-fueled organization was almost entirely national.
International.
Right. If people were just motivated by profit, like the old economists thought, you'd expect huge international companies, trusts dominating everything. And yeah, you saw some of that, but not enough to really change the political game away from nations fighting each other.
Why not?
Russell points his finger squarely at rivalry. He thinks for powerful people, the drive to win, to beat the other guy, is often stronger than just the love of money.
Like sports teams.
Exactly his analogy. Big businesses organize nationally, not just to make the most profit, but to beat their foreign rivals, like football teams obsessed with victory, not just scoring points. And this rivalry, it hooks into nationalism, pulling ordinary people along emotionally.
So that's the core danger science and industry delivered for Russell.
Yes, they were strong enough to create these incredibly powerful national organizations, but not strong enough to create effective international ones. Political attempts like the League of Nations. Doomed, he thought, without some underlying economic agreement, some shared control of resources and markets.
But that was blocked by
That rivalry, by the powerful business leaders who prioritized beating the competition over just making money peacefully together.
And this, he argues, makes old liberal ideas kind of obsolete.
Pretty much. Liberalism assumed, equal individuals, free competition. But the modern economy, he says, just isn't compatible with real free competition except maybe between heavily armed countries. Economic power gets concentrated, so liberty ends up being just for the few people holding that power.
Things like free trade, a genuinely free press, unbiased education, he saw those fading.
Yeah, either gone or going fast, in his view. Even civilian control over the military, a big liberal achievement, seems shaky given the political turmoil after World War I. He mentions Russia, Italy, Spain.
So looking ahead from 1924, say 50 years, what did he predict?
Continued. Drastic increase in government power, ultimately controlled by whoever had the military and the raw materials. He thought maybe democratic forms might survive in the West, but governments would use education and the press to create a compliant population. A subservient democracy, he called it.
Wow.
And competing national economic blocs would keep nationalism burning fiercely.
That is incredibly grim. Is there any hope in his picture?
Well, he offers something he hesitantly calls a hopeful element, but it's a very dark kind of hope.
Okay.
The world is finite, right? And science keeps making the most efficient size for an organization bigger and bigger. Technically, the world is becoming one economic unit. So Russell suggests the conditions needed to organize the entire planet as one unit. They'd soon exist.
The technical possibility for global organization.
Right. And here's his bleak scenario. If two massive rival power blocks fight it out when we reach that point, the winner might finally have the power, the capacity to impose that single worldwide organization needed to stop humanity from destroying itself.
A world government, but born from conquest, not agreement?
Precisely. He's very clear. This world wouldn't look anything like liberal or socialist dreams, at least not at first. It would be a tyranny, imposed by the victors, terrified of rebellion, clamping down hard on liberty.
Doesn't sound great.
No. But, he speculates, if the initial revolts are crushed, maybe the losers eventually just give up hope, accept their place. And once the rulers feel truly secure, maybe they become less harsh, less demanding. With no external rivals, why push so hard?
So life might be unpleasant, maybe stagnant, but possible, not total annihilation.
That seems to be the calculation. After horrific wars, maybe that seems like the least bad option. A stable world order, even one built on force, might see evils lessen over time. maybe even allow for more genuine democracy eventually, though he sounds pretty doubtful about that last part.
But his core belief remained pessimistic.
Yeah. He basically says, look, given human stupidity and our destructive passions, world government will probably only happen through force. It'll be cruel and tyrannical initially, but he thinks it might be the only way to save any kind of scientific civilization, and maybe it could get better eventually.
Okay, let's shift gears then to maybe the most speculative and frankly unsettling part of the essay, his predictions about the anthropological sciences.
Right, the sciences of humanity itself. He admits this is guesswork because they were so young then. But the potential impact, enormous, he thought.
What sort of things?
Birth control is when he flags as already becoming practically important, especially for stabilizing any future world government. Uneven population growth could blow things up. He saw its use spreading in developed countries, even though governments often opposed it. Why? Superstition, he says, wanting bigger armies, maybe keeping wages low. He predicted populations in white nations would stop growing within 50 years, maybe even decline.
And he saw this as an example of individual desires winning out over state desires.
Kind of. Individuals wanting smaller families for economic reasons versus the state wanting cannon fodder. And in this case, he argues the individual desire is actually less harmful globally. Because, with science reducing it to deaths, the only other ways to limit population are war and famine, unless you use birth control.
So opposing birth control is implicitly choosing.
War and famine, that's his sharp point. He notes that's basically what had been happening since 1914 anyway.
He uses a pretty cutting analogy, too, doesn't he? About farming.
Oh, yeah. Farmers manage their livestock numbers carefully, right? Cattle, sheep. If farmers were as careless about their animals as humans are about humans, they'd just breed too many and let the extras starve slowly, which farmers would think is wasteful and humanitarians would call cruel. But for humans doing it to humans, that's somehow the only proper course. Ouch.
Sharp indeed. But he saw dangers in birth control, too.
Definitely. What if the more intelligent people used it more, and the less intelligent didn't because governments kept them ignorant about it?
Yeah.
You could end up giving stupidity a biological advantage, as he puts it. Or if, say, white populations shrank while others grow rapidly, helped by Western medicine reducing their death rates. Yeah. He warns about whites becoming outnumbered, maybe even wiped out by mercenary armies raised from other groups. He thought France was already kind of leaning that way with colonial troops.
Again, linking it back to national power and conflict, and world government as a potential, albeit imposed, solution.
Yeah, a world government could, in theory, manage population growth globally, maybe limiting it amongst subject peoples.
Okay, moving from quantity to quality. Eugenics.
Right. Improving the human stock by selective breeding. He assumes superstitions fade, and governments might start sterilizing undesirables.
Like who?
Initially, maybe the severely mentally disabled, which he suggests could be desirable, but then the slippery slope. He predicts the power would inevitably be used against rebels, political opponents. Then maybe people who fail school exams.
To raise average intelligence?
Theoretically. But he worries it could be bad for exceptional intelligence. He asks how many intellectually disabled people is one Charles Dickens worth? And Dickens' own father, the model for Mr. Micawber, definitely wouldn't pass any desirable parent test.
A very pointed question. And eugenics could aim to increase desired types, too.
Yeah, and this is where he makes a crucial point about who wields scientific power. Scientists assume reforms they propose will be run by people like them, rational, idealistic.
Yet that's not how it works.
No. He says it's a fallacy. Like feminists assuming future female voters would all be like the dedicated suffragists or socialists thinking their state would be run by pure idealists. Reforms always get handed over to the average person, the average official, with all their biases.
So if eugenics could breed for desired traits,
it wouldn't be based on the eugenicists' high-minded ideals. It would be based on the ideals of the average, probably unimaginative, maybe prejudiced government official.
Oh, dear.
He speculates maybe prime ministers or bishops would end up fathering half the population, and he doubts that's an improvement. He suspects they breed for obedience, conformity, lack of initiative, though he admits he might just be cynical.
Okay, what about psychology? He saw huge potential there, too.
Immense, though still conjectural back then. Advertisers were already using psychologists to figure out how to create irrational beliefs. He predicted this would become super useful for governments wanting to persuade people they were wise and good.
Spin doctors, basically.
Yeah, powered by psychology. He also mentions psychological tests, like the U.S. Army used. He was skeptical, They measured much beyond average smarts and worried they'd misclassify geniuses, artists, mathematicians whose brilliance might not fit the standard mold.
But the really scary stuff was physiological control.
That's the most disturbing bit, controlling emotions through physiology. He mentions the ductless glands, what we call the endocrine system, hormones. He speculates it will become possible to make people aggressive or timid, highly sexed or not, just through injections, maybe diet.
Wow.
In a stratified society, the state could literally administer personalities. Rulers' kids get the command temperament. Workers' kids get the obedience dose. Forget speeches or logic, just give them a shot.
That is terrifying.
He admits the specific science might change, but he firmly believes science will find ways to control emotion. It is scarcely possible to doubt, he writes. And when that happens, our feelings become whatever the rulers want them to be.
So elementary school becomes
Not just about facts, but about injecting the right emotional disposition. A power, he says, beyond the dreams of the Jesuits.
chilling, but he still has that cynicism about the administrators.
Always. He doesn't think the people wielding this incredible power will be any smarter or better than the school boards of his own time. Technical skill, he concludes, doesn't make you sensible or virtuous in your goals.
Okay, so let's pull all this together. What's Russell's core warning here?
It's pretty stark. Science isn't inherently good or bad. It just massively increases the power of whoever holds it. If their aims are good, great. Science helps. But if their aims are bad, and Russell thought the powerful in his day were driven by bad motives, leading to destruction, then science just makes them better at being destructive.
This brings us back to that heart versus head idea, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Science is the head, the knowledge, the ability, the power. But it doesn't provide the heart, the kindness, the virtue, the wisdom to use it right. And without the heart, Russell says, more power just means being more cleverly diabolic. He does say, look, if humans were purely rational, if we always acted in our genuine long-term self-interest, which he thinks usually aligns between people, then maybe intelligence alone could be enough.
But we're not purely rational.
Nope. Passions mess things up. They make us see our own interests wrongly, make us hurt others thinking it helps us. We won't act in our real best interest, he argues, unless we have some generous impulses, some ability to care beyond our narrow immediate gain.
Which leaves him to that paradox, that catch-22.
Yeah. He sees how vital it is to make people kinder, maybe even using those physiological methods he speculated about. He imagines this secret group of good guy scientists kidnapping world leaders and injecting them with benevolence.
A nice fantasy.
But the twist is the scientists would need the injection first. Otherwise, being human, they just use the tech to make soldiers fiercer or grab power for themselves.
Ah, so you need to be good to implement goodness, even if you invent a goodness drug.
Exactly. And if we can't solve that, we're back to his bleakest forecast. The only way to sail the world from science's destructive power is widespread kindliness. But we can't seem to achieve that. So he sees us heading down the path the rational Houyhnhnms took with the beastly yahoos in Gulliver's Travels.
Okay.
Extermination, a path Russell fears humans seem determined to apply to each other.
Wow, so science hasn't given us self-control or kindness.
No, it's given groups, communities, nations more power to act on their collective passions. And he believed those passions were mostly bad hate, rivalry, dominance. That's why science, for all its potential good, is actually threatening to destroy civilization.
Is there any way out besides that awful world government born of conquest?
That really is the only sliver of solid hope, as he puts it, that he offers. And he offers it very hesitantly, that grim possibility of one group winning total dominance and imposing a stable, if tyrannical, world order.
But even then, he immediately undercuts it.
Right away. He brings up the Roman Empire. Dominance led to stability, sure, but also stagnation, sterility. Maybe, he muses, the collapse of civilization would actually be better than that. It's incredibly bleak.
So Bertrand Russell wrote this essay, Icarus, 100 years ago, a full century, long before so many things he talked about became real, or maybe even worse than he imagined.
Yeah.
Thinking about it now, what parts of his fears about science, power, how we organize ourselves, about basic human nature, what parts feel really sharp, really prescient today? Like they're echoing in our world right now.
Yeah.
And maybe which bits feel more like anxieties tied specifically to the 1920s, to the tech and worries of his particular time?
It definitely leaves you with a lot to chew on, doesn't it?
Sure.
What does reading Russell challenge you, listening now, to think about? About this immense power science keeps handing us, and about who or what impulses are really in the driver's seat.